Good evening, afternoon, morning, depending on where you are tuning in from. And happy Pride, everyone. My name is Sydney Yeager, and I am the Senior Public Programs Producer here at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I'm so pleased to welcome you all to Solidarity and Persecution, Lesbian Experiences in Nazi Germany. Here at the museum, we are dedicated to the crucial mission of educating our diverse community about Jewish life and heritage before, during, and after the Holocaust. As part of that mission, our programs are meant to illuminate the stories of survivors, broader histories of hate, bigotry, and anti-Semitism through time, stories of resistance against injustice, and more. Thank you so much for joining us today virtually. We hope that if you are able to, that you will visit the museum in person to see our current exhibitions, including Courage to Act, Rescue in Denmark, which is the museum's first exhibition for visitors ages 9 and up. We also hope that you will join us for our other Pride programming this month. On June 23rd, we have Roots and Branches, where families and children are invited to make crafts and learn about influential queer Jews throughout history. And on June 27th, we're showing the film Dear Freddy, about a 19-year-old openly gay German man who set up a daycare center in Auschwitz. So we hope you will join us for both of those events as well. Closed captions are available on today's program, and instructions on how to turn captions on or off are posted in the chat. If you have questions for our speaker during the program, please put them in the Zoom Q&A box, so not the chat, the Q&A, and we're going to get to as many as we can at the end of the hour. Today, we are so honored to be joined by Samuel C. Huneke. Samuel is Assistant Professor of History at George Mason University. A historian of modern Germany, his research focuses on gender and sexuality, legal history, and the history of democracy. He is the author of States of Liberation, Gay Men Between Dictatorship and Democracy in Cold War Germany, and A Queer Theory of the State. And he is co-editor of the forthcoming volume, Reimagining Citizenship in Post-War Europe. So thank you so much for joining us. And now I'm going to hand things over to Samuel.
Okay, thank you, Sydney. I'm going to share my screen and get started. Okay, thank you everyone for coming out to listen to this talk this evening. My thanks also to Sydney Yeager and the Museum of Jewish Heritage for the kind invitation to come and speak about my research today. So I'm really eager to share this research with you. I've been researching the history of lesbianism in Nazi Germany for almost a decade at this point, and it's sort of turned into a larger book project. And I was actually just telling Sydney before the call that I today finished a full manuscript of that book. So you can hopefully be looking for it sometime next year to be published. Okay, so I'd like to start with a longer quote. On Saturday, the bowling club, the Merry Nine, of which we are already aware, organized a spring ball in the Concordia ballrooms in Berlin. The event, in which approximately 300 lesbians took part, started around 8 o'clock and ended around 1 o'clock. There was no occasion to intervene. Apart from displays of affection, which were secretly exchanged here and there at the tables, and also while dancing, nothing special was noticed. During the breaks, the women largely stayed at the buffet and at the bar. Quite a bit was imbibed, mostly beer, caraway schnapps, and prosecco. So what do we have here? Quite clearly, it's a report about a ball of lesbian women in Berlin. And you can infer that it's some sort of official agency, a bureaucrat. And in fact, this is a police report. But what you might not expect is that the report is dated April 1940, a little over 6 months after the start of World War II and deep in the middle of the Nazi era. Now, for most of you, I would assume that this fact flies in the face of many of your assumptions about Nazi Germany, that you would have a ball of 300 queer women partying in central Berlin in 1940. This doesn't mesh with what we at least think we know about queer people and Nazism. And this image here is a ticket stub from one of this group's many balls. This particular one is from 1938, and it's the Ball of the Bad Boys, or Busenbuben. The name Merry Nine of the group came from the 9 bowling pins because it was ostensibly a bowling club, although it really existed to put on these sorts of events. So historians have known about this group for quite a while, this group, the Merry Nine. And we know that they put on these balls from at least 1935 until at least 1940. They might have done so for longer, but the documentation we have is for those years. And none of us historians who write about this period have really known what to make of the group until now. And it complicates the question of persecution, namely, were lesbian women victims of Nazism? So that question is actually, and this might surprise you, a somewhat open question still. There are many historians, politicians, and activists in Germany who answer that question of persecution in the negative. And this is an op-ed from a German newspaper. The title reads History in the Service of a New Victim Culture, or Opferkultur. This is one op-ed sort of expressing this negative view of these people who assert vociferously that lesbian women were not persecuted by the Nazis. In fact, the last book to be published on this topic, which came out almost 30 years ago in 1996, insisted, quote, there was no systematic persecution of lesbians. More recently, another historian who was also the spokesperson for Germany's main LGBTQ activist group dismissed the, quote, hyperbole and false interpretations of those who argue that lesbian women were persecuted. As a result, it has taken years for any official recognition for lesbian victims to occur. Now, most of the historians, activist politicians who make these sorts of claims do so for a very specific reason. Female homosexuality was never explicitly criminalized in Nazi Germany. You perhaps have heard of paragraph 175 of the German Penal Code, and that's what these two images are referring to. On the left is a pamphlet by the queer socialist writer Kurt Hiller, arguing for the abolition of paragraph 175 and calling it die Schmach des Jahrhunderts, the shame of the century. On the right is a poster from a 1970s activist group in West Germany saying, away with paragraph 175. So this is a famous law in Germany. It's essentially the country's sodomy law, and it was used to criminalize male homosexuality specifically. It was first adopted in 1871 when the German Empire was unified by Otto von Bismarck, and it was strengthened in 1935 by the Nazi government and used to prosecute some 50,000 men between 1935 and 1945. But again, the law was never used to criminalize female homosexuality. And so on the one hand, this meant that lesbians were not under the kind of immediate legal threat that queer men were. On the other hand, it meant that the Nazi government didn't leave the kind of massive trove of archival documents that historians have to work with who are researching queer men or male homosexuality. It's much harder to find relevant files in police records and court records about queer women because there isn't this unified legal category under which they can be categorized. So paragraph 175, it was on the books when the Nazis came to power, but it was a fairly weak statute. It only criminalized penetrative sex, which was difficult to prove in court. But in 1935, 2 years after the Nazis come to power, the fascists strengthened the law. They made any act that could be construed as homosexual in nature punishable, and they also added new penalties for what they considered to be aggravated homosexual behavior. In particular, they added charges for male prostitution, as well as the charge of, quote unquote, seducing a man younger than 21. They added this because the fascists generally believed that most homosexuals had been seduced into homosexuality as a teenager or a young adult. This is very similar to the grooming rhetoric that is still, unfortunately, prevalent in our country and other countries. So, in augmenting this fear of homosexuality, in particular male homosexuality, as a social contagion, the Nazis believed that gay men were prone to form conspiratorial cliques that could destabilize or even overthrow the state. So, when the Nazis strengthened this law, paragraph 175, in 1935, they decided to leave female homosexuality out of the statute. And they didn't do this for any particularly sympathetic reason, but rather because of the inherent misogyny of the National Socialist Project. And these are two propaganda posters from the Nazi era. And you can see in both women are fulfilling a very sort of traditional maternal role. On the right, you have this sort of Aryan-looking woman with a child. Similarly, on the left, on the right, you have a sort of Aryan-looking family, 3 children, protected by the German eagle. So essentially, the Nazi ideology was deeply misogynistic. It wanted to return women to hearth and home. One of the many things that Nazism was reacting against was the modernity of the Weimar Republic, of Germany's first experiment in democracy. So returning to female homosexuality specifically, many Nazis, again, saw homosexuality as a social contagion, something that spread through the seduction of youth and that threatened both social bonds and the stability of the state. But from this perspective, in a state like Nazi Germany, female homosexuality would pose less of a problem because Nazi ideologues saw women primarily as wives and mothers, cut off from wider social and political worlds dominated by men. That is, if you believe that most women will be at home, not going out, not participating in large social organizations, not going to work, then there's less of a risk for this kind of social contagion for female homosexuality. They essentially had fewer opportunities to either seduce or be seduced. And even if they were somehow seduced into homosexuality in the Nazis' view, women enjoyed virtually no political role in the Nazi order, meaning that the spread of female homosexuality would have no kind of destabilizing effect on the state itself. At the same time, Nazi lawyers dismissed female sex drives. They argued that even if women had sexual relations with each other, they could still become good heterosexual wives and mothers. In the words of one Ministry of Justice official, quote, "Women who have engaged in unnatural fornication are not lost forever as a procreative force in the same way that homosexual men are." So we do already, just from legal documents, have some sense of what the Nazis thought about female homosexuality and about lesbian women. It was certainly not something to be desired or even necessarily tolerated, but because of the inherent misogynistic National Socialist worldview, many also did not consider it to be as grave of a threat as male homosexuality. I'll also add that one other reason that they decided not to explicitly criminalize female homosexuality was the fear of false convictions, that essentially they understood sex, again, still to be essentially penetrative. And there was this fear that if you sort of essentially got rid of that, it would be very difficult to distinguish between what they would have thought of as a legitimate friendship between women and a lesbian relationship. So the seeming lack of archival sources that I alluded to earlier, the lack of overt criminalization, and the seeming disregard for female homosexuality, all these together is what leads some historians to argue that lesbian women were not persecuted in Nazi Germany. And I'm finally getting to the punchline. I hope to convince you today that that view is wrong, that in fact queer women were persecuted. Also, though, I hope to show and convince you that in spite of that persecution that queer women faced, they also exercised a surprising degree of agency under Nazism, a form of agency that I've come to think of as a kind of queer ingenuity that engendered, at least in some cases, a queer solidarity. Now, by no means am I the only one who's arguing that lesbian women were, in fact, persecuted in this period. In the decades since the 1970s, many scholars have done extraordinary work to bring queer experiences from this era to light, particularly coming out of the context of gay and lesbian activism starting in the early 1970s in West Germany. A few names, if you're interested in reading more, are Ilse Kokula, Claudia Schockmann, who's the author of the book I mentioned from 1996. More recent scholars, including Jens Dobler, Anna Heikova, and Xavier Nunn, and Lori Marhofer, have all published really remarkable work. And I encourage you very much to not only go and read my own work, but also to read theirs. They've they and myself, we've all sort of over the last decade or two uncovered ever more cases, not only of persecution of queer women, but really extreme persecution. These cases of persecution are also colored with this resistance and solidarity that I alluded to. So I'd now like to dive into a specific example. This image is of two women, Marta Haluza, who is on the right, the taller blonde one, and Margo Holzmann on the left. Now, Marta and Margo were dancers in the 1920s in the Weimar Republic before the Nazis took power. And they met while dancing at the same cabaret in Hamburg, which is the large northern port metropolis of Germany. And they met in 1932, the year before Hitler was appointed chancellor. They fell in love and moved in together. In the early years of the Nazi era, it seemed that they didn't have too much trouble. It seems that they were occasionally denounced both because Margo was a Jew and also because it seems they engaged in sex work to make ends meet. But it doesn't seem that they were in grave danger in those early years. The trouble really started with the outbreak of World War II. So, as I've mentioned, Margo was Jewish. Her sisters and her mother had managed to flee and make it to England before the war began, but she and her father remained in Germany. Her father, Paul Holzmann, was interned. He was forced into hard labor, and he was eventually murdered at the extermination camp Sobibor near Lublin in Poland. But Margo was aware of all this. And she, in fact, had received orders that she too had to report to be transferred to the East, essentially a euphemism for being sent to a ghetto or a killing center. And so one day, very soon before that deadline, before she would have to report for deportation, she met a Chinese man named Qi Langyu, who lived in Berlin and worked as a waiter. She immediately recognized him as an opportunity to escape from persecution. And she started dating him. They eventually had sex, and she convinced him to marry her on the grounds that her period was late, that she was pregnant. They were wed on November 13th of 1941. This was actually the morning that Margo was supposed to report to be transferred to the East. And they had to convince a judge to let them get married earlier than they sort of were supposed to. The initial appointment they had for getting married was the following day. This is significant because Qi Langyu was a Chinese citizen, meaning that Margo now had Chinese citizenship and was exempt from deportation. She was exempt from wearing the Star of David and had won a sort of measure of safety. Although China was, as you probably know, not a German ally, it was fighting the Japanese who were German allies. And so Chinese people living in Germany, there were about 1,600 of them at the time, were also in a somewhat tenuous position. So Margo marries him, takes his last name. She becomes Margo Liu. However, her husband wasn't in on it. He didn't realize that she already had a lover, or that she was only interested in him for his citizenship, or that she was a lesbian. So he was perplexed when she spent their wedding night with Marta instead of him. And he was equally perplexed when she didn't want to move in with him. Eventually, she did move in with him, but brought Marta along with her. And then eventually they moved to escape him. So eventually he sued for divorce. And to aid the divorce case, he denounced Marta and Margo as both lesbians and prostitutes to the German police. And here's where the police get involved. This is in part why we even have these files and know so much about these two people. Again, female homosexuality was not a crime, but the police in Nazi Germany, not to mention the police in other times and places, they didn't always stick to the letter of the law. There was a wide gray area of activities that they considered suspicious, even if they weren't necessarily criminal. And if they thought that you were suspicious, chances were that they would investigate, and they might very well find something criminal that you had done or that they could sort of pin on you, and then eventually charge you. So the police dragged Marta and Margo in for questioning. They questioned their neighbors. They questioned their neighbors' children even. But Marta and Margo were steadfast in their denials. And they even cast blame on Chi. Margo told officers about coming home one day to Chi's apartment. Quote, I saw around 30 people at the table and standing around the playing table. Massive sums of money lay on the table. When I entered, everyone became agitated, and my husband sprang up from the table. So what she's describing here is an illegal mahjong gambling ring. This is sort of fantastical to imagine an illegal Chinese gambling ring in the heart of World War II Berlin. It's a pretty confounding assertion. It's not one that I've seen any sort of corroboration for. But again, they were trying to make charges stick against her husband and to sort of deflect attention away from them. In any event, Marta and Margo got off from this altercation with the police. Again, they strenuously denied that they were lesbians or that they were lovers. It's not a denial that the investigating officer believed, but the officer also understood both that she was acting out of a desire for revenge and to aid his divorce case. And there was enough sort of smoke that they created about Chi to deflect interest. In fact, the police officer forwarded Chi's file on to the prosecutor, the local prosecutor, to perhaps investigate and even charge him for gambling. There's also a racial element here as well. They were obviously very interested in Margo because she was Jewish, but they were also suspicious of Chi because he was Chinese, because he was a foreigner. And that was also something that Margo and Marta used to kind of deflect attention. They claimed that Chi had tried to set up Marta with one of his Chinese friends. Again, Marta was a quote unquote Aryan, and so that would have aroused fears of miscegenation among these officials. And so they really grasped at everything they could to try and deflect attention. Again, female homosexuality wasn't explicitly illegal. They did a really good job of sort of deflecting attention. And so they were essentially able to walk out of the police station with nothing more than a registration with a central compendium of homosexuals in Germany that they were lesbian. Now, this case is both typical and unusual. It's typical in that there were many, many other women who were explicitly denounced as lesbians in the Nazi years. Neighbors, friends, colleagues, and sometimes even family members would tip off the police about lesbian women that they knew. It also is typical, I think, of the bonds of solidarity that I argue we see in the queer history of the Nazi era. It would have been very easy for Marta to leave Margo when the Nazis seized power, or after the 1935 Nuremberg laws were passed that stripped Margo of her citizenship, or after the Yellow Star of David was introduced in the Reich in September of 1941, or at any number of times between the seizure of power in 1933 and the end of the war in 1945. But she didn't. And in fact, she stayed with Margo throughout these ordeals and did what she could to protect her lover, even to the point of lying to the criminal police. There are other cases of queer women who did not stay with their lovers, of course. Charlotte Wolf, for instance, was a prominent Jewish sexologist in Berlin at the time of the seizure of power, and she settled in London in 1933 after Hitler was appointed chancellor. In one of her memoirs, she wrote about how her girlfriend Catherine abandoned her already in 1932 because she was Jewish. Only to then, after the war, quote, play the role of the woman who has always loved Jews after Hitler had been defeated. So the point that I'm trying to make about Marta and Margo, as well as others, is that they made active choices to resist fascism in solidarity with each other, often facing more extreme persecution as a result. But the question of persecution brings us to how their case is actually somewhat unusual. Both Marta and Margo were outsiders in the Nazi state in numerous regards. and they survived this encounter with the police relatively unscathed. Marta was a sex worker as well as a lesbian. On top of that, Margo was Jewish and married to a Chinese man. Those who came to the attention of the police and were considered outsiders could easily find themselves termed a quote-unquote asocial. This was a nebulous grab bag category that the National Socialists increasingly used after the mid-1930s and then whisked off to a concentration camp. In fact, asocials made up the vast majority of concentration camp prisoners up until the November pogrom of November 9th, 1938, which is oftentimes seen as the sort of start of the Holocaust. So I want to bring up one other case that I think is a useful contrast with Marta and Margo, specifically around this issue of being an outsider and being an asocial. This is the case of Vout Hawk. This is a case I came upon in an archive in Wiesbaden near Frankfurt am Main several years ago, and is really at the heart of my understanding of queer women in Nazi Germany. So, in the middle of Hawk's file, there is a yellowing letter written out in careful script dated December 22nd, 1941. This letter right here, sent 3 days before Christmas. Lena Baumgartner, who is its author, wrote to the director of the Preungesheim Women's Prison, where her daughter, Vout Hawk, was serving a 3-month sentence for avoiding work. It reads, "I implore you to let me know the whereabouts of my daughter, Vout Hawk. She should have been released already on the 17th, but I am still waiting on her today and am in great distress for my child." On Christmas Eve, 2 days later, the director of the prison wrote back a cold, typewritten note. "In response to your letter of December 22nd, 1941, you are informed that your daughter Vout was taken into the custody of the Wiesbaden police at the request of the local police president. As far as I know, Lena never saw or heard from her daughter again. What the letter did not tell her was that Vout had been transferred to Ravensbrück, the largest female concentration camp north of Berlin. From there, she would be transported to Auschwitz, where she was murdered in March of 1943. And what we have here on the left is the record of Vout being sent to Ravensbrück. She's number 39, and you can see that she's marked as Asoz, that's short for asocial or asozial. And then on the right is her record with the International Tracing Services after the war that notes that she died at Auschwitz on March 10th, 1943. In terms of the exact date of her death, there are different dates that show up in different records, but they all say March of 1943. So I'd like to step back for a moment to try and understand how a 19-year-old girl went from a 3-month prison sentence to Ravensbrück to Auschwitz to her death. She was born in Biebrich in 1922, shortly after the end of World War I, to Lena Baumgartner and a man whom Nazi officials would later describe as a, quote, colored occupation soldier, allegedly an American. She grew up either not knowing or not acknowledging this parentage. In a handwritten biography that she wrote shortly after her arrest for her police file, Hawk described herself as the daughter of her mother's dead husband, Karl Bleitner. And actually on the image, you can see under her name is the name Bleitner, which was her maiden name. At the age of 18, after World War II had already started, Vout went to the Wiesbaden Employment Office, hoping that she might find work as a conductor for the public transportation service. Instead, officials conscripted her to work on a farm as part of the war effort, and this was a very common thing. Young women who were unwed would oftentimes be sent to work in farms. And oftentimes, ironically, the farmers found them more of a nuisance than any sort of help. In fact, Vout had little interest in agriculture, and she in fact told the farmer who she had been sent to work for, quote, I don't enjoy agricultural work. She told him this straight up. And so the farmer and his wife said to her, well, then don't show up to work if you don't enjoy it. So she didn't show up to work. And I hoped that the employment office would sort of get the hint and reassign her. Instead, a warrant was issued for her arrest, and she was sentenced to 3 months in prison on September 17th, 1941. Once she was ensnared in the Nazi penal system, though, more information about Hawk's upbringing began to catch the attention of functionaries. The women's prison sent her file to the National Socialist Youth Services for an assessment, requesting an assessment of Hawk and what should happen to her after her release. The report that the party issued was damning. First of all, she had had to repeat second grade. And these academic troubles that had led to her repeating a grade, the agency chalked up to, quote, laziness and indifference. It was also noted that her father was, again, a quote unquote colored American occupation soldier. This would have been a serious allegation in a state that prized racial homogeneity above all else. Moreover, Lena Baumgartner's former husband, Karl Bleitner, whom Hawk believed to be her true father, had been taken into so-called protective custody in fall of 1933, shortly after the seizure of power, and he had allegedly hanged himself in protective custody. Essentially, the Gestapo or the SA or the SS, whichever branch of the police or the party had arrested him and taken him into essentially a rudimentary camp, had murdered him because he was a communist. Of Lena Baumgartner, Vout Hawk's mother, the agency wrote that she was, quote, animalistically libidinal, and that during the occupation after World War I, she'd spent almost every night in the American barracks. At some point in the 1930s, she had also been forcibly sterilized by the Nazi health courts. The report further noted that Vout was married to one Peter Hawk, with whom she had had a child in 1940, but the couple was separated, and Vout was allegedly using money meant for the child on herself. The report went on. It noted that both Lena Baumgartner and Vout Hawk entertained numerous lovers, and that Baumgartner had recently been imprisoned for, quote, forbidden contact with a POW. Again, this probably would have been sexual contact of some sort. Of Vout's lovers, we are left to assume that at least some of them were allegedly women because the report described her as a lesbian. Now, this note actually touches on a conundrum of queer history in any period, but especially in Nazi Germany. How do we as historians talk about acts and identities of people who are long dead and didn't leave very full records? It's one thing to say that Nazi bureaucrats thought that Vout was a lesbian, and it's clear from this document that they did. But we don't know if she thought of herself as a lesbian. We don't know why they decided to label her this way, or what she thought of the designation, or even if she knew of the designation. These are essentially unanswerable questions. Many of the cases in my research present similar questions, also about gender identity. Many of the individuals whom the Nazis labeled lesbian also identified as quote unquote transvestites. This is a term that was in wide circulation at the time, and it indicated a whole array of acts and identities. Some were women who enjoyed wearing men's clothes out to bars and clubs. Others who in the 1920s sometimes wrote of themselves as a quote unquote true transvestite were what we would today call trans men, individuals designated women at birth, but who identified themselves as men. A large trans subculture existed in the Weimar period, and it even persisted into the Nazi era, overlapping with the homosexual subculture. Indeed, at this point, many people identified as both homosexual and as transvestites. At the balls of the Merry Nine, for instance, femme lesbians mingled with what we would today term butch lesbians, as well as with trans men. The point is that identity is a messy concept that never maps easily between the past and the present. But it's impossible to tell the history of queer women in the era, or indeed any era, without also talking about gender and about transmasculine individuals. And part of this story, when we get back to the Merry Nine, is of the kind of effective solidarities between different queer people that extended past bounds of gender and sexuality to encompass other forms of difference. So that was sort of a sidebar. Back to Vout Hawk. Just a few months After receiving this report, officials registered her as a so-called asocial in Ravensbrück in February of 1942. This report, which had in fact concluded that Vout should be sent to a, quote, workhouse or camp, thus offers a set of explanations as to why someone arrested for evading work and only given a 3-month sentence would within 2 years be dead in Auschwitz. The category of asocial, which I mentioned earlier, is important to this story. National Socialism had come to power in part on the strength of its vision for an Aryan Volksgemeinschaft, a cohesive racial community. Because this idea of the Volksgemeinschaft was a key tenet of Nazi ideology, its opposite or other, that is, those who couldn't adapt to the community for some not quite definable reason, they came to be labeled asocial. The category of asocial thus became a flexible category of persecution. Black Germans, queer people, sex workers, single women, Roma and Sinti, and many others fell under this umbrella and could be whisked away to concentration camps, where they oftentimes were marked with a black inverted triangle. In the late 1930s, as I've mentioned, asocials made up a disproportionately large number of those interned in concentration camps. By the middle of 1938, up to 70% of all camp prisoners were asocial. When we examine Vout's various acts and identities and how Nazi bureaucrats perceived them, it shows how easily she fit into this nebulous concept. Her female homosexuality and her sexual licentiousness that officials attributed to her clearly played some part in this determination. Only 4 lines after naming her a lesbian, officials indicated that the, quote, inner cause of the crime was, quote, moral rot. Moreover, Hawk's mother's background also made her a prime candidate for designation as an asocial. But there were other factors too. Her alleged laziness and her unwillingness to work, in their eyes. The Nazi government, after all, classified thousands of Germans as, quote unquote, work shy and sent many to workhouses or concentration camps. By 1938, Sachsenhausen concentration camp incarcerated more than 6,000 work-shy inmates. Finally, her status as the daughter of a colored, likely Black American occupation soldier, undoubtedly played a role in her murder. And these here are images of the memoirist Hans Massaquoi, who was a Black German who survived the Nazi period and wrote a famous autobiography called Destined to Witness about it. And you might note the image of him as a child. He's actually wearing a sweater with a little swastika sewn into it. Black Germans were absolutely outsiders in this period, but they were not targeted in the same manner as Jews were. Nonetheless, they still faced persecution and discrimination that stemmed all the way to the Weimar years. In the 1920s, the children of German women and Black occupation soldiers were attacked by right-wing propaganda as the so-called Black Horror on the Rhine. After taking power, Hitler's governments had many of these children sterilized between 1935 and 1937. Many were also sent to concentration camps. But the Nazis never fully codified the place of Black people in Germany. Some, such as Hans Massaquoi, survived relatively unscathed. Others, such as a man named Jonas Ndoki, was accused of sexually assaulting white German women in the late 1930s and early 1940s and was executed. In the words of the historian Tina Kampt, who was one of the first people to write about the experiences of Black Germans, the Nazis' treatment was neither systematic nor coherent. All this is to say that Hawk was not a victim of Nazi persecution for any one reason, but she was a victim rather because of the intersection of numerous acts and identities that made her legible to Nazi officials as a dangerous social outsider who needed to be disposed of by extrajudicial means. Because of her race and her sexuality and her alleged laziness and her disruption of the war effort, all of these offenses and identities conspired to lead to her diagnosis as an asocial. That is to say, the concept of intersectionality, which sees persecution as an outcome of the confluence of different acts and identities that combine multiplicatively. It's useful for explaining cases like Hawk's, where no single explanation will quite suffice. It's clear that her alleged status as a lesbian played a part in this persecution. in convincing Nazi officials that her, quote, moral rot was an important reason to send her to the concentration camps. Now, I could go into detail about many, many more cases. There are dozens of them in the book that I'll be publishing next year. But the point that I'm trying to make is that lesbian women faced persecution despite the fact that female homosexuality was not explicitly criminalized. This persecution emerged from prejudices and practices of the state and manifested in everything from denunciations to surveillance to being murdered in concentration camps. I term this kind of persecution heterogeneous persecution, by which I mean an unsystematic persecution that is an emergent quality of societies and states. Acknowledging this also means that we need to change how we memorialize queer victims of Nazism. And this here is a memorial orb that has been officially consecrated at the Ravensbrück Memorial Site in memory of lesbian victims there. So as I've alluded to, for a long time, gay men were kind of the privileged queer victim group. The most prominent symbol of post-war gay liberation, the pink triangle, was taken from the Nazi camps. Instead, I think it's important to start thinking about erecting memorials and remembering history in a way that accounts for the broad diversity of persecution that targeted all manner of LGBTQ people under German fascism. And it is, in fact, encouraging that Germany has taken steps in this direction, such as laying this memorial orb. With that argument about persecution sort of tucked away, I want to return at the end of this talk to the troubling case of the Merry Nine, which I started the talk with. How do these grand balls held in the heart of Hitler's capital square with the argument I've just made that lesbians were, in fact, persecuted? And the answer I'd like to suggest is twofold. First, we can see persecution in the police's handling of these balls. They were regularly surveilled by officers who jotted down information about the attendees. These reports betray a deep interest in trying to find reasons to arrest the women and stop future gatherings from taking place. And I'm happy to say more about that in the Q&A. The second, though, is that state of persecution, that desire on the part of the penal apparatuses of the Nazi state to persecute these women, it doesn't abrogate the agency that we also see here and the forms of resistance and solidarity that many queer people developed under fascism. As I mentioned, I've started to think of the gumption that it must have taken to host these events as a kind of queer ingenuity, a way of seeing into the liminal spaces between law and practice to forge effective solidarities that cut across lines of class, race, gender, and sexuality. The case of the Merry Nine is, I think, a particularly vibrant and happy example of this. Regular parties of hundreds of queer people that could go on in large part because they were hosted by queer women whose sexualities were not criminalized in the same way that queer men's were. But the Aryan women who organized these events, they didn't exclude Jews, which we know because the presence of those Jewish women perturbed the police officers who were surveilling them. In a society in which race was paramount to everything else, something in these queer women's experiences made them seek the friendship of persecuted racial outsiders. There's something I think quite mysterious about this, in what gives people the capacity to resist such violently imposed norms. And so this is why I'm not just thinking about it as resistance or as solidarity, but rather this more open-ended idea of queer ingenuity. And then this is where I come back to Marta and Margo. After they were let off in the mid-1940s, you might have thought that they would try and keep their heads down and live out the end of the war. Maybe they would try to flee the country even, but they didn't. Instead, they joined an underground resistance group that printed seditious flyers, essentially critical of the Nazi government. Near the end of the war, they were caught by a pair of Gestapo agents and arrested. They were taken to a Gestapo prison where they were tortured, beaten, and told that they were candidates for execution. However, this was close enough to the end of the war that they were able to escape during the chaos of the Soviet invasion of Berlin. They eventually settled in London, where they lived together until they died in the 1990s. Theirs is, and many of these stories are, I argue, stories not just of persecution, but also of resistance to fascism, inspired by their experiences on society's margins. And it offers, I hope, an inspiring vision of what solidarity might look like in the 21st century as well. So I will stop there. Thank you all for listening, and I'm very eager to take your questions.
Samuel, thank you so much for that really excellent presentation. I learned a lot, and I think our audience did too. And I do want to mention before we move into questions that you mentioned transgender people during the Holocaust. We have a few programs on that at the museum. So I will put the links to those in the chat as well. So I hope you'll
Wonderful.
check those out. And one of them features Lori Marhofer, who you mentioned in your talk. So I hope all of you out there will check those out too. But and also continue to put questions in the Q&A. We have time for many, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. But I do want to start with a question that came in about Margot's first arrest. Was there a risk, as you said, she was Jewish, so was there a risk of her at that point, because she was Jewish, being sent to the camps, or did her marriage kind of exempt her from that still?
So, as I mentioned, there were various kind of run-ins with the police that they had, mostly for sex work in the 1930s. Towards the end of the 1930s, start of the war, those run-ins increased. And so there's actually an earlier arrest where Marta and Margo were very fearful that she would be sent to a camp, but they were able to actually bribe the official interrogating her to be let go. In terms of the arrest, in 1941, that one, it actually is like kind of shocking to me that they let her go just on the basis of her Chinese citizenship. I mean, that was sort of the legal theory. That was why she decided to marry Chi. But there's something confounding about seeing a Nazi police officer file a report saying, well, she's a Chinese citizen, there's nothing we can do. That's certainly, and again, Chinese citizens had a kind of tenuous place in Nazi Germany. There weren't that many of them, between 1 and 2,000 in the entire country. And certainly towards the end of the war, the SS decided to round up most of them and imprison them as sort of enemy aliens. So it is actually kind of surprising that the police were willing to let them go on that theory.
Thank you. And just as sort of a follow-up question to that, you said that you thought Margot might have tried to flee after her first arrest, but was there ever an attempt that did she ever attempt to flee
To
Germany at all?
the best of my knowledge, no. Again, the records are not perfectly complete, but as far as it's noticeable that her relatives did flee to London, and I don't particularly know why she decided to stay. It may very well have been because of Marta. But as far as I know, she never attempted to leave. And I know that while they were still dancing together, they actually did go on some kind of international tour. I know that they at least danced together in Czechoslovakia. So those would have also offered opportunities to get out of the country if they had wanted to.
Thank you. And I want to echo one comment that we got, that Margot and Marta's story would be such an interesting film.
It would be. And actually, there's a great little slim biography of them. Unfortunately, it's only published in German, but it's this sort of little 70-page volume by a woman named Ingeborg Boxhammer that was published about 8 or 9 years ago. So anyone who can speak German, I would definitely recommend that to them.
Yes, thank you. And so setting aside sort of Margot's story, were there differences in experiences between how women who were Jewish and also lesbians, and women who were not Jewish and lesbians, were treated by
Yes.
the state?
Yeah, definitely. So essentially, and I was sort of prioritizing story over the broader kind of statistics or arguments that I have. But essentially, if you look at the cases we know of queer women who come to the attention of Nazi authorities in aggregate, And again, we have dozens of these at this point. There's sort of a hierarchy almost of different either acts or identities that get the attention of the police. And this is where this idea of intersectionality comes in. So certainly if you were a racial outsider, that was sort of the worst, right? That would almost always lead to some kind of more severe punishment, being sent to a camp, quite possibly even being murdered. And being Jewish was obviously kind of the most extreme version of that. And so there's a very well-known set of cases, two women named Mary Punyar and Henny Sherman, who were sent to Ravensbrück. They were examined under the auspices of part of the Nazis' quote unquote euthanasia program. So this was before mass gassings had started happening in the East, but there were sort of there were gassings happening in Germany for these quote unquote euthanasia victims. So they're both examined in the auspices of this program, and the examining doctor writes of both of them that they are Jewish, but also that they are lesbian. He makes a very specific point of noting down both of them. And so we don't have a report saying, this is why we decided to gas them, but we do have this doctor's note. And I think it's fairly compelling to say that both the fact that they were lesbian as well as the fact that they were Jewish sort of collaborated or were determinative in the fact that they were sent to the Bernburg sanatorium to be gassed when they did. The next sort of most extreme or worst was if you were accused of political crimes. And we see this especially in the wartime period, where women who are working in some way, if they're found out to be lesbian, they can be accused of essentially trying to sabotage the war effort. And that can be construed as a political crime and may very well lead to them being sent to a concentration camp. And then the sort of next worst was if you were seen as a public nuisance, if you were seen as someone who was endangering youth, seducing young women, all of those maybe wouldn't lead you to a concentration camp, but certainly could lead to your arrest and imprisonment.
Thank you. So another question that we had that came in, we've talked about queer women in Germany,
Right.
but we know that the Nazis, took over large swaths of Europe. So can you talk a little bit about the fate of queer women in other countries that were taken over by the Nazis?
Yes and no. So my research really does mostly focus on Germany specifically. Probably the next best case that we have is Austria, which is taken over in the Anschluss in 1938. Interestingly, Austria has its own sodomy law, paragraph 129, which does criminalize, it's unusual, and it does criminalize female homosexuality. And we know that that continues to be enforced even after the Anschluss. They don't sort of reconcile the two laws. They keep Austria's separate law on the books, but it's only enforceable in what used to be Austria, in the Ostmark. For other countries that were occupied by Germany, so not annexed to the Reich, but occupied, generally they would keep whatever the local country's sodomy or anti-homosexuality laws were. And so I don't, it wasn't like the Jews where the Germans were going in and enforcing a kind of standardized persecution that led everyone to being sent to concentration camps and killing centers in Poland. It was much more sort of based on the local country's sort of traditions and laws.
Thank you. So another question that came in, and I'm gonna broaden this out a bit. They were asking specifically about where they can learn more about the Mary Nine, but I'm wondering, I know you talked a bit about other scholars that people can look at for research on this
Yeah.
topic. Maybe you can repeat that and also
Yes.
give us other suggestions.
So the sales pitch I would give you is if you want to learn more about the Mary Nine, buy my book when it comes out. I have a whole chapter about the Mary Nine in it. And it's interesting. It's something there's some German scholars who have written about it in German. There's not really much written in English about the group. Some of the scholars who I mentioned, Laurie Marhofer is a fantastic scholar who I believe is in the middle of writing a history of trans people in Nazi Germany. Xavier Nunn, I mentioned, also about to publish a history of trans people in Nazi Germany. Anna Haikova, who is a historian at the University of Warwick in England, is sort of one of the foundational people in this field. She's done a huge amount to promote queer Holocaust research, and actually maintains an online bibliography of research on this topic. And so that's actually something I would very much encourage you to check out if you're looking for further reading. The only English language book on the topic is by Claudia Schuckmann. It's called Times of Masquerade. Uh, and it came out in 1996 with Columbia University Press. It's an excellent book, but there's been a lot more research that's been done since then. And so in some ways it's sort of out of date, but it's a very well-written and engaging book that I would recommend. So those are a few of the names.
Amazing. And I'll also mention that Anna Hykova was also on another one of our programs as well. So
Yeah.
you can learn more about her research there too. So I know we are getting to the end of our time. So I'm sorry if we were not able to get to everybody's question. But I do just want to end with, we know that this is a very important topic to discuss and to make sure that we continue researching. But I wonder if you could speak from your own perspective about why you think this is so important to talk about.
Yeah. Ooh, so I mean, this is something I've really been grappling with as I've been sort of writing the introduction and conclusion to this book. Um, and there's a whole host of reasons. I think in part, there's just fundamentally something that I find quite redemptive about the process of writing history and about remembering people who have lived in the past. And in particular, with when we talk about Nazi historiography, there's a whole host of groups who were for a long time labeled the forgotten victims, these, asocials, career, quote unquote, career criminals, Black Germans, Roma and Sinti, queer people of all stripes. And so I think there's something quite redemptive about researching these and reclaiming their histories and talking about the persecution as well as their agency. Um, I also think that there's a sort of intellectual use to this, in particular, trying to tease out the kind of persecution that wasn't written down in laws or policies is actually a really useful exercise for trying to think about how persecution exists in other times and places, and including in our own world today. That it's not just a matter of looking at what the law says, you actually have to look at practice as well. And then finally, as I sort of alluded to, I think that this kind of queer ingenuity, this solidarity that you quite remarkably see from some of these people, it's not a sort of political philosophy for the present, but I do think that there's something kind of inspiring about it.
Well, thank you so much, Samuel, for this presentation, for answering all of these questions, for doing this research. And I just so appreciate you taking the time to be with us.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. I really enjoyed this and appreciate it.
Yeah, and I will also highly encourage all of you to keep an eye out for the upcoming book. And Samuel, maybe you can tell us how we can keep an eye out for that.
Yes, so it will be appearing with the imprint is called AEVO, AEVO. I think I'm spelling that right. And it's the trade imprint of the University of Toronto Press, which published my first book. I'm also on social media, and we'll definitely be, tweeting about it and posting about it as it progresses.
Thank you. Yeah, so I highly encourage you all to keep an eye out for that. And if you enjoyed today's program, I also hope that you'll consider making a donation to support the museum at mghnyc.org/support, and also joining us for our upcoming programs, which you can find at mghnyc.org/current events.